The rope snapped. Stephen McCrae felt the world drop out from beneath him before his mind could even register what had happened. One moment he was descending the canyon wall, hand over hand, following the narrow ledge that his horse had spooked away from, and the next he was falling, tumbling through red-dusted air, the canyon walls rushing past him in a blur of ochre and crimson. He hit the ledge below with a force that drove every last breath from his body, his right leg folding beneath him at an angle that sent white-hot agony screaming up through his hip. The canyon swallowed him whole. He lay there at the bottom of Redstone Canyon, in the territory of New Mexico, in the year of our Lord 1873, staring up at a sliver of blue sky 60 feet above him, and he thought two things simultaneously. The first was that he was going to die here. The second was that Sheriff Holly's Garrett was going to get away with everything. The sun was already beginning its slow slide toward the western rim. In another 3 hours, the canyon floor would be in full shadow. By nightfall, the temperature would drop 30 degrees. With a broken leg, no horse, no supplies, and walls too sheer to climb, Deputy Stephen McCrae understood with cold, crystalline clarity that he was completely and utterly trapped. He had been so close. He had found the evidence he needed, tucked inside the false bottom of a saddlebag abandoned near the canyon mouth, documents that proved Garrett had been taking payments from the Danforth Railroad Company to drive the Mescalero Apache off their grazing lands by any means necessary. Those means had included 3 dead Apache scouts, a burned settlement, and a 16-year-old boy who had disappeared in the spring and had not been found since. Stephen had been riding hard to get back to the marshal's office in Santa Rosa when his horse had caught the scent of something on the wind and gone sideways, and the rope he'd been using as a handhold on the canyon shortcut had frayed clean through. Now the documents were in his coat pocket, pressed against his chest, and he was lying on a shelf of rock with a leg that would not hold him, and the nearest town was 14 miles in any direction. He did not cry out. He had been raised in the Texas Panhandle by a father who believed that noise was the enemy of survival, and so he pressed his teeth together and breathed through the pain and began, with methodical desperation, to take stock of what he had. His rifle had fallen somewhere above him. His pistol was still on his hip. He had a canteen that had survived the fall but was less than half full. He had a folding knife. He had the documents. And he had, somewhere above the canyon walls, a setting sun. He did not know that she was already watching him. Susanna Abbott had been in Redstone Canyon since dawn. She had not been looking for a stranded deputy. She had not been looking for trouble of any kind. She had come to the canyon the way she came every 3rd week of the month, with her worn leather satchel over her shoulder and her mule, Coppice, ground-tied at the canyon mouth, to harvest the medicinal plants that grew nowhere else within 40 miles. The canyon's unique microclimate, sheltered from the wind and collecting moisture from a hidden seep spring deep in the rock, produced a pharmacy of rare desert herbs that Susanna had been cataloging and studying since she had arrived in the territory 4 years ago at the age of 22. She was 26 now, and she was arguably the most knowledgeable healer between Albuquerque and El Paso. She had learned from her grandmother in Tennessee before the war, and then from a Mescalero Apache woman named Hinovi, who had trusted her enough to share knowledge that had been kept inside the tribe for generations. She had read every medical text she could order through the territorial mail, including a copy of Joseph Lister's recent work on antiseptic techniques that had arrived 6 months ago, and which she had read 4 times. She spoke passable Spanish and a working vocabulary of Mescalero Apache. She had delivered 32 babies, without losing a single mother or child. She had set bones, drained infections, sutured wounds, treated snakebite, and once performed an emergency removal of a ruptured appendix on a mine foreman's son using a field knife, whiskey, and a steady hand while a roomful of terrified men watched. The boy had lived. She was kneeling at the base of the canyon wall, carefully cutting stems of yerba santa with her small, curved harvesting knife, when she heard the crack of a rope giving way, and then a body hitting rock. She was on her feet before the echo finished bouncing off the canyon walls. She found him 40 yards along the canyon floor, on a rock shelf about 8 feet below the main canyon bottom. He had already pulled himself to a seated position against the wall, which told her two things immediately. He had the self-discipline not to try to stand, which meant he knew the leg was compromised. And he was conscious, which was either very good or a mixed blessing, given the pain he was certainly experiencing. She scrambled down the short drop to the shelf with the ease of someone who had navigated this terrain hundreds of times, and she crouched beside him with her satchel swinging forward and her dark eyes moving over him in quick, expert assessment. "Don't move," she said. He looked at her with eyes that were very blue and very bright with pain, and something she recognized as suppressed alarm at her sudden appearance. He was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red sandstone as the canyon walls. He wore a deputy's badge on his coat. His face was set in the rigid stillness of a man who was working very hard not to make a sound, and despite everything, she registered distantly that it was a striking face. "I was not planning to," he said through his teeth. "Good," she said. "What is your name?" "Stephen McCrae, deputy out of Santa Rosa. Who are you?" "Susanna Abbott." "I am the healer out of Cimarron Creek." She was already running her hands along his right leg, gentle but efficient, feeling through the fabric of his trousers for the damage. "I need you to tell me exactly where the pain is worst. Be precise. This matters." He stared at her for a moment as if no one had ever asked him to be precise about pain before. Then he swallowed and said, "About 4 inches above the ankle, and there is something wrong with the knee. Different kind of wrong." She nodded. "The ankle is fractured, the fibula, I believe. The knee is dislocated." She sat back on her heels and met his eyes directly. "I can put the knee back in immediately. The ankle I will need to splint. It is going to hurt considerably." He held her gaze. "Do what you need to do." She liked that. No bravado, no dismissal, no attempt to tell her he was fine, just direct acceptance of necessity. She pulled her satchel open and began removing items with the organized speed of long practice. Strips of clean linen, a small vial of willow bark tincture, 2 straight sticks of dried mesquite that she always carried because you never knew what a day would require. "Drink this first," she said, handing him the vial. He looked at it. "What is it?" "Willow bark extract. It will not eliminate the pain, but it will take the edge off within about 10 minutes. I am going to splint the ankle while we wait for it to begin working, and then I am going to reduce the dislocation." And if I had said no, she looked up at him with an expression that was not quite amusement but was adjacent to it, "then I would have done it anyway, because your knee cannot wait, and the alternative is permanent damage to the joint. But I find that people cooperate better when they understand what is happening to them." He drank the tincture without further comment. She worked quickly and competently, her hands moving with a sureness that she had spent years building. She had hands that remembered things. Her grandmother had told her that once. The best healers have hands that remember what the mind forgets. As she worked, she began talking, not to distract him exactly, but because silence in a canyon with a man in serious pain had its own dangerous weight. "How did you end up on that ledge?" she asked. "My horse spooked. I was using a rope along the canyon wall. The rope frayed." "Old rope, apparently older than I thought." He inhaled sharply as she tightened the splint, but he did not pull away. "Why are you in the canyon?" "Harvesting." "I come every few weeks." She nodded toward her satchel. "The plants that grow here are not found elsewhere at this elevation. The canyon holds moisture differently." He looked at her with a sudden focus that she could feel even through the pain he was managing. "You are a healer, not a nurse, not a doctor's wife, an actual healer." "Yes," she said simply, "in Cimarron Creek. Yes. I have ridden through Cimarron Creek a dozen times. I did not know there was a healer there." "Most people do not look for one until they need one," she said. "Are you ready? The tincture should be working." He nodded, his jaw set. What she did next required speed and precision that most people, watching it for the first time, found startling. She positioned herself carefully, braced his leg, explained briefly what was about to happen, And then, with a single controlled movement that used her body weight as leverage rather than brute force, she reduced the dislocation. The joint slid back into place with a sound that made Stephen McCrae's whole body jerk rigid, a sound that echoed off the canyon walls, and for a moment she thought he might actually pass out from the shock of it. He did not. He pressed the back of his head against the canyon wall, breathing through his nose in long, measured pulls, and after about 30 seconds he opened his eyes and said, in a voice that was remarkably steady, "That is considerably better." "It will swell," she said, "but you have full function. The joint is intact." She sat back and looked at him properly for the first time now that the immediate emergency was managed. "The ankle is splinted. You cannot put weight on it. We have a problem." "The walls," he said. "Yes. The descent from the canyon rim here is not navigable with your current injuries, and it will be dark in approximately 3 hours." She looked up at the sliver of sky, calculating. "The temperature will drop to near freezing tonight. You did not come prepared for an overnight." "No," he said. There was something shifting in his expression now, something beyond pain, a contained urgency. "Miss Abbott, I have something on me that needs to reach the marshal's office in Santa Rosa. Documents. If I do not return, the marshal's office will wait," she said firmly. "Your survival will not. We are going to focus on the immediate problem. You do not understand. I understand that you are in a canyon with a broken ankle and a recently dislocated knee, that it will be dark and freezing in 3 hours, and that whatever is in your pocket cannot help you if you are dead." She said it without heat, without drama, simply as fact. "Now, tell me what you know about this canyon. How far have you traveled in it before?" He paused, clearly recalibrating. She watched him make the decision to trust her, which was a thing she had learned to recognize over years of working with people in crisis. There was always a moment where they either surrendered to the care being offered or they fought it. He surrendered cleanly and without resentment, which told her something significant about his character. "I know there is a seep spring about a quarter-mile east," he said. "I know the canyon forks. The South Fork is a dead end. The North Fork comes out near a place called Miller's Flat." She felt something light up in her chest. "How far to the North Fork outlet from here?" "1.5 miles, maybe 2. "I know a route," she said quietly. "It will not be easy with your leg, but it is manageable before dark." She stood and shouldered her satchel, looking down at him with an expression that was direct and steady and completely without apology. "I am going to need you to trust me completely, Deputy. I have been in this canyon many times. I know paths that do not appear on any map. You will do exactly what I tell you when I tell you without argument. Can you agree to that?" He looked up at her from the rock shelf, this large, rugged man with his broken leg and his deputy's badge, and his secrets pressed against his heart in a coat pocket. And something crossed his face that was not quite what she expected. It was not the condescension she sometimes encountered from men who found it difficult to take direction from a woman. It was not reluctant compliance. It was something closer to genuine recognition, as if he were seeing her clearly for the first time and was genuinely surprised by what he found. "Yes," he said, "I can agree to that." She allowed herself one small breath of something that was not quite relief, and then she got to work. Getting him off the lower shelf required improvisation that Susanna had become very good at. She fashioned a crutch from the longer mesquite branches in her satchel, bound with strips of linen at the top to protect his arm. She showed him how to distribute his weight, how to use the canyon wall as a secondary support on the narrower sections, how to move in a way that protected the splinted ankle without overcorrecting and stressing the reduced knee. She had helped injured people navigate terrain before, but never a man of Stephen McCrae's size and build. He was not a small man to support. He was also remarkably good at following instructions. That surprised her. Men of his physical type, in her experience, tended toward either stoic overdoing, pushing through pain in ways that caused further damage, or a resentful helplessness that made them difficult patients. Stephen was neither. He listened to each instruction carefully, applied it precisely, And when something was not working, he said so without embarrassment so she could adjust. Within 20 minutes they were moving east along the canyon floor at a pace that was slow but sustainable. "Tell me about Cimarron Creek," he said, after a few minutes of navigating. The talking was a good sign. It meant he was managing the pain adequately and his mind was clear. "Small town," she said. "Maybe 200 people when everyone is in residence, less in winter. I have been there 4 years. Where did you come from before?" "Tennessee originally. I spent 2 years after the war in Missouri working with a hospital mission. Then I came west." He was quiet for a moment, picking his way carefully between 2 boulders with her steadying hand on his arm. "You came west alone?" "With my medical supplies and my mule," she said. "Yes." He glanced at her sideways, and again she caught that expression. Not pity, not concern of the patronizing kind. Something more like a reassessment happening in real time. "That is a considerable thing for a woman alone in this territory." "It is a considerable thing for anyone," she said. "I happen to be the one who needed to do it." She paused to check their path. The canyon was beginning to narrow slightly here, which was right. She knew exactly where they were. "Why did you become a deputy?" "I was a ranger for 6 years," he said. "Before that, Army. After the rangering, I settled in Santa Rosa. The sheriff's position came open and I took it. Then Sheriff Hollis Garrett was elected and I became his deputy." There was something in the way he said the sheriff's name, a controlled flatness that carried weight. She filed it away. "Do you trust him?" she asked. "Your sheriff." The pause that followed was answer enough. "No," he said finally. "I do not." "Is that what is in your coat pocket?" Another pause. He looked at her with those very blue eyes, calculating. "You are perceptive. I am a healer. Reading what people are not saying is half the work." She helped him around a jutting ledge of rock. "You do not need to tell me. It is not my business." "It might be," he said, surprising her, "if it involves the Apache bands that use this territory, because you mentioned Cimarron Creek and the Mescalero camps are within 30 miles of there." She stopped walking. She turned to look at him directly, and now her expression was different, alert, sharp. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that Sheriff Garrett has been taking money from the Danforth Railroad Company," he said, quietly and steadily, "to drive the Mescalero off their traditional lands. What that has looked like in practice is 3 dead scouts, a burned camp, and other things I am still documenting." He met her gaze without flinching. "The documents I have prove the financial connection. If I can get them to the U.S. Marshal in Santa Rosa, Garrett is finished. But if Garrett finds out what I have before I reach the Marshal, then I am finished." Susanna looked at him for a long moment. Something was building in her chest that was not fear and was not entirely surprise either. It was a recognition of stakes that she had not known she was walking into this morning. "I know those camps," she said quietly. "I know those people. I have treated them. I know a woman named Hanovi who she stopped. I understand what is at stake." "Then you understand why I need to move quickly." "I understand why we both need to move quickly," she said, "and why we need to be careful. If Garrett has men looking for you, he likely does by now," Stephen said. "I was supposed to report back this morning. I am 7 hours late." She absorbed this, turned it over, looked at their situation from every angle the way she looked at a difficult diagnosis. She checked the angle of the sun. She thought about the North Fork outlet and what lay beyond it. She thought about her mule Coppice waiting at the canyon mouth, which was on the west side in the opposite direction from where they were heading. "We cannot go back for my mule," she said. "I know, I am sorry. Coppice is a sensible animal. He will find his way to water and wait for me." She said it with a calmness she mostly meant. Coppice had been with her for 3 years. He was fine. She made herself believe that. The North Fork outlet at Miller's Flat. "How far from there to the road that runs toward Santa Rosa?" 4 miles, he said, "maybe less." "Is there a settlement between Miller's Flat and Santa Rosa?" "There is a place called Arrowhead Station," he said slowly, thinking. "Stage relay, run by a man named Obadiah Fenn. He is a trustworthy man. He has no love for Garrett." "Then that is our destination," she said. "We can send word from there or find horses." She looked at him steadily. "Can you make 2 miles through this canyon on that leg?" He met her look with one that was just as steady. "I can make 2 miles." "Good," she said. "Then let us move." The canyon held secrets in its walls, and Susanna knew most of them. She had mapped this place in her mind over 4 years of careful observation, the way she mapped the body of a patient, systematically, respectfully, understanding that everything was connected to everything else and that nothing was incidental. She knew where the seep spring ran closest to the surface, where the rock became reliable underfoot, and where it turned treacherous with hidden loose shale. She knew where a natural arch of sandstone created a passage that looked impossible until you angled your body exactly right. She knew the signs that warned of flash flooding from above, the wet smell in the air, the certain quality of stillness in the animals, though today the sky was clear and blue and offered no such threat. She guided Stephen through all of it, and he followed with a trust that grew more complete with every passage she navigated correctly. She watched him recalibrating, watched the moment when he stopped waiting for her to make a mistake, when his entire posture shifted from a man grudgingly following to a man genuinely relying, and she found she did not mind being relied upon. She had built her whole life on being someone who could be relied upon. They rested at the seep spring where she refilled his canteen and her own small flask, and she changed the wrapping on his ankle splint which had shifted slightly with the walking. While she worked, he watched her hands with an attention that she felt without quite looking up to confirm it. "How long have you known how to do this?" he asked. "Set bones. Since I was 14. My grandmother taught me." She made a small adjustment to the mesquite stick. She had learned from her own grandmother, who had learned it from a woman before her. There is a whole tradition that is mostly invisible because the women who carried it were not formally educated. "But you are formally educated," he said. It was not quite a question. She looked up then. "As formally as the territory allows," she said. "I have read everything I can obtain. I correspond with physicians in St. Louis and in Philadelphia. A doctor in Albuquerque lets me observe his surgical cases when I travel there." She kept her voice level, though she was aware of a careful pride she did not often express aloud. "I know things that most physicians practicing in this territory do not know. Not because I am naturally exceptional, but because I have refused to stop learning." Something happened in his expression, not pity, not condescension, not the slightly uncomfortable admiration that some men offered her, the kind that always came with a silent addendum of "for a woman." This was something simpler and more complete, recognition without qualification. "I believe you," he said. They moved on. The canyon narrowed to a passage barely wide enough for 2 people, and then opened again into a wider chamber where the walls glowed amber in the afternoon light, and Susanna felt the familiar complicated love she had for this place. It was harsh and it was beautiful, and it hid things and it revealed things, like most places worth knowing. "There is something I want to ask you," Stephen said, navigating a section of loose rock with careful deliberation. "And you can tell me to mind my own affairs if you prefer." "Ask," she said. "You have built something remarkable out here alone," he said. "For years, no established family, no protection, in a territory that is not always kind to women who live independently. What keeps you here?" She was quiet for a moment, considering the question as seriously as it deserved. "The people," she said finally. "The miners' families and the ranchers' wives and the Apache women and the children who would otherwise have no one. There is a need here that is so vast and so immediate that leaving feels like—" She paused, searching for the honest word. "Like betrayal." He was quiet for a moment. "You feel responsible for them." "I feel connected to them," she said, "which is different from responsibility, though it sometimes looks the same from the outside." She glanced at him. "Why did you stay in Santa Rosa when you knew what Garrett was?" He took a careful step over a seam of rock. "Same reason," he said quietly. "More or less." They looked at each other then, briefly, and something passed between them that was wordless and clear, the particular recognition of 2 people who have organized their lives around the same unspoken principle. It was unsettling in the way that all genuine recognitions are unsettling. It made her look away first. The north fork of the canyon opened up before them about an hour before sunset, the walls spreading wide and the floor rising gradually toward an outlet that showed a broad sweep of open desert beyond. Susanna had been watching the light and the angle of shadows, and calculating their time with the focused attention of someone for whom the difference between arriving somewhere in daylight and arriving in darkness was frequently the difference between life and death. "We will make the outlet before dark," she said. "Thanks to you," he said. "Thanks to both of us," she said. "You are not a complaining man, which matters more than you might think." He made a sound that might have been a short laugh, quickly controlled. It did something she had not entirely expected to the architecture of his face. The outlet at Miller's Flat was exactly where she had expected it to be, because in 4 years of navigating this canyon she had never been wrong about Miller's Flat, and the open desert beyond it stretched flat and pale and navigable in the last golden light of the afternoon. Susanna looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of a plan that had worked, tempered by the knowledge that the harder problem was still ahead of them. 4 miles to Arrowhead Station, Stephen said, looking out at the expanse. He was leaning on the improvised crutch, his face drawn with a tiredness that the controlled features could not entirely hide. The day had cost him considerably. "I can make it." She looked at him, at the set of his jaw and the careful way he was distributing his weight, and made a rapid clinical calculation. "You can," she agreed, slowly, "and we stopped twice for rest." She looked at the open ground. "If Garrett has men looking for you, they will more likely be on the roads. Anything we can do to move off the most obvious path." "The land dips east of the main track," he said. "Follows an old creek bed, longer but less visible." "Show me," she said. He showed her, and they moved into the deepening desert afternoon with the careful economy of 2 people who were focused and capable and quietly worried, though neither of them said the worry aloud, because saying it would not help, and both of them had made a similar decision, long before they had ever met each other, to spend their energy on solutions rather than on fear. The first rest stop was at the ruins of an old adobe building that had been abandoned long enough for the desert to begin reclaiming it. Susanna re-examined the ankle in the fading light and found the splint holding well. She made Stephen drink the rest of his water and refilled the canteen from her own small supply. She took nothing for herself until he had taken what he needed, which was a professional discipline, and also, she realized, had begun to feel like something else, a care that was slightly more personal than the clinical variety. She sat back on a crumbling adobe block and looked up at the first stars beginning to appear, and Stephen sat beside her, closer than pure necessity required. The warmth of him was actually welcome because the temperature had dropped as sharply as she had predicted, and the desert night was coming in cold and clear. "Tell me something about yourself," he said, "something that has nothing to do with healing." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because I have spent the entire afternoon being the patient, and I would like to spend 5 minutes of rest simply being the other person in a conversation." She felt something shift in her chest. It was a surprisingly thoughtful request. Most people, in her experience, when they were injured and frightened and being guided through danger, forgot entirely that the person guiding them was also a person. "I paint," she said. "Watercolors. Mostly plants and landscapes, because those are what I have around me, but sometimes faces. I sold 3 paintings once to a woman passing through Cimarron Creek on her way to California, and she sent me a letter from San Francisco afterward to tell me they were hanging in her parlor." "That is remarkable," he said, and he sounded genuinely pleased by this. "Healer and painter. People are not usually only one thing," she said. "No," he agreed. "They are not." He was quiet for a moment. "I play the fiddle poorly. It was my mother's, and I learned enough to make people wince and then never improved beyond that point." She turned to look at him. The image of this large, serious man with a fiddle was so incongruous and so human that she felt it open something in her chest. "Why did you stop improving?" "The war," he said simply. "By the time I came back, I was a different person. The music felt like it belonged to someone else." He looked at the stars. "I still carry the fiddle. I just have not tried to play it in a very long time. She understood that completely, the way things could belong to a former self and yet be too precious to release. She understood it in the bones of her, and she thought that she could have said so. But the moment was already complete, and they sat in the cooling desert night with the stars multiplying above them and the old adobe crumbling softly around them. And the silence was the comfortable kind that she almost never found. "We should move," she said at last. "It is 2 miles more. We will make better time while the ground is cool." They moved. The second rest was briefer, standing more than sitting, long enough for Stephen to manage the pain and for her to assess his gait and adjust the crutch height by a half-inch, which made a visible difference in how he was moving. She showed him how to angle his upper body slightly, redistributing the load. He made the adjustment immediately, without ego, and walked better for it. She noticed that she kept noticing things about him. The patience with which he endured, not the stoic performance of patience, but something that seemed genuinely embedded in his character. The way he continued to be curious about the landscape even in pain, asking her once about a particular cactus, asking her once about a light she had seen moving on the far hillside. She had told him it was likely a lantern, someone traveling the main road, too far away to identify and better to simply watch. He had watched it for a moment and then moved on without obsessing over it. That was a rare quality in a man under pressure. The ability to register a threat, assess it, and continue. The lights of Arrowhead Station appeared in the dark distance like a small cluster of earthbound stars, and Susanna felt the relief move through her like warm water. Obadiah Fenn was a barrel-chested man of 50 with a white beard and the permanent squint of someone who had spent 40 years looking at the sun. He opened his door to them with a lamp in one hand and a rifle in the other, and when he saw Stephen his expression shifted through surprise and concern to something harder. "Deputy McCrae," he said, "I heard Garrett's men came through asking about you." Stephen looked at Susanna. She looked back at him. "When?" Stephen asked. 2 hours past. "Said you'd gone missing, which I took to mean they were more interested in finding you than in worrying about you." He stepped back and held the door open. "Come in, both of you." Inside the station, which smelled of wood smoke and old coffee and horse leather, Fenn settled them at a heavy wooden table. He had a wife, a quiet Tejana woman named Graciana, who appeared from the back room, assessed the situation in about 5 seconds, and immediately began heating water. Susanna approved of her. Graciana brought warm water and clean cloth without being asked, and Susanna began a proper examination of Stephen's injuries in real light for the first time. What she found confirmed her earlier assessments. The fibula fracture was clean, non-displaced, which was the best possible version of a broken ankle. The knee joint was intact and the reduction had held. He was badly bruised along his ribs and hip from the fall, and he was running on will and willow bark, but nothing else was broken and no internal damage was evident to her careful examination. "You were lucky," she told him. "I had good care," he said. She looked up from her work and found him watching her with that same expression, the one that had started as surprised reassessment and had become something warmer and more settled as the hours passed. She held his gaze for a moment longer than was entirely clinical and then looked back at his ankle. "You need a proper splint," she told him. "What I made in the canyon will hold overnight, but tomorrow you need to see." She paused. "I have the materials at my place in Cimarron Creek." "Cimarron Creek is 12 miles north of here," Fenn said, from across the room where he was feeding his stove. "The road to Santa Rosa is 8 miles east." "The documents need to reach the marshal," Stephen said to Susanna. He said it without urgency, as a fact that had to be held alongside the other facts. "They do," she agreed. "How do you propose to get them there with this leg?" "Fenn," Stephen said, "do you have a man you trust to ride to Santa Rosa tonight?" Fenn looked at him steadily. "What am I trusting him with?" "Documents that prove Hollis Garrett has been taking railroad money to clear Mescalero Apache from their lands," Stephen said. 3 dead men's worth of proof." Fenn was quiet for a moment. Graciana had stopped moving in the next room. Then Fenn said, "My nephew Lewis. He is 17 and he can ride like the devil himself, and he has no love for Garrett because Garrett's men burned his father's fence line 3 years ago and called it a border dispute. He paused. Will these documents hold? They will hold, Stephen said. I need an envelope and whatever seal you have, and I need a letter to go with them addressed to U.S. Marshal James Culhane. I have all of those things, Fenn said. What followed was an hour of careful work. Stephen wrote his letter to the marshal by lamplight, in a precise hand that surprised Susanna with its clarity, explaining the documents, their provenance, their significance, and requesting that the marshal act before Garrett could be warned. Susanna watched him write and thought about what it cost to do what he was doing. To spend years watching someone corrupt their office and the law they were supposed to embody, gathering evidence patiently, and then to trust it all to a 17-year-old writer in the dark and hope it arrived safely. What happens to you if the marshal does not act quickly enough? She asked him when he had sealed the envelope and handed it to Fenn. Garrett will come looking for me, he said. He already is. And if he finds you, he will try to discredit whatever I have sent, or worse. He said it matter-of-factly, not without weight but without performance. Then you should not be here when morning comes, she said. He looked at her. Where do you suggest I go? Cimarron Creek, she said. And then, because she was a direct woman who had learned that the cost of indirectness was usually higher than the cost of clarity, she added, with me. I can do proper care for your injuries, and Garrett does not know you have any connection to me. No one who knows you does. He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him process this, the practicality of it, and whatever else was running beneath the practicality, which she was beginning to be able to read, at least in rough outline. I do not want to put you at risk, he said. I have assessed the risk, she said. I do it all the time. It is manageable. He met her gaze. You are certain? I am rarely entirely certain about anything, she said, with an honesty that made him blink. But I am certain enough about this. Will you come? He said yes. Louis Fenn rode out into the dark an hour later, young and intent, and carrying Stephen's envelope in an oilskin pouch inside his coat. Susanna watched him go from the station doorway and felt something tighten in her chest that was either prayer or its practical equivalent, the focused will that directed what energy it could toward a necessary outcome. Gratiana had found a narrow cot in the back room, and Stephen was asleep on it before she had finished refilling her medical kit. She sat at the table in the station's main room and drank the coffee Fenn offered her, and thought about the day she had started this morning in the canyon with her harvesting knife and her mule and her ordinary purpose, and how entirely extraordinary it had become. He is a good man, Fenn said, from across the table. I do not know him well enough to say, she said. I have known him 3 years, Fenn said. He is a good man, one of the few. He looked into his coffee. Whatever is between the two of you? Nothing is between us, she said, perhaps too quickly. Fenn looked at her with the kind of look that 50 years of watchful living produces, a look that does not argue but does not concede either. He said nothing more. She slept in the chair for a few hours, which she was accustomed to, and in the early gray of pre-dawn she roused Stephen and they set out for Cimarron Creek with a horse Fenn loaned them, a solid bay mare named Riene, and a set of directions that Susanna did not need because she knew the road. Stephen could not ride in the conventional way with the splinted ankle, so they arranged him on the horse with his injured leg straight, and she walked alongside, which was fine. She had walked longer distances, and the morning air was clean and cold, and she was energized by the clarity that came after a difficult night successfully navigated. You are not going to ride, he said, about 20 minutes into the journey. I am not injured, she said. You were in the canyon all day and then navigating in the dark, and you have not slept properly. I have slept adequately, she said. Susanna, he said. She looked up at him. He had used her first name without seeming to notice that he had done it, and she found she did not mind at all. Come up, he said. The horse can carry both of us at a walk. I would not suggest it at speed with my leg, but at a walk it is manageable. I am fine, she said, but without full conviction. "I know you are fine," he said. "I am asking anyway." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took his offered hand and let him help her up behind him on the mare, and settled there with her hands resting lightly on his sides, because there was nowhere else sensible to put them, and the warmth of him was immediately and embarrassingly welcome in the cold morning air. She was aware of him with a precision that was not clinical at all, the breadth of his back, the careful steadiness of him even on a horse with a broken ankle, the faint smell of dust and wood smoke that was simply what the day had made of both of them. "Tell me about Cimarron Creek," he said. "Tell me what I will find there." She did. She told him about the town with the specificity of someone who had invested in it completely. The general store run by Martin Oakes, who was cantankerous but fair. The schoolhouse that had been built 3 years ago, and the teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Ada Bright, who had arrived with 40 books and a fierce determination, and had since doubled her library. The church that was technically Baptist but had developed over time into a comfortable ecumenical arrangement, because there was only one church and many faiths, and the Reverend, a man named Callum, had decided that he preferred a full building to a theologically pure empty one. She told him about her own small house and clinic, which she had built with assistance from the town and then spent 2 years improving. "You have a clinic," he said. "2 rooms," she said. "One for examination, one for convalescence. I built the second one after that first winter when I had 3 people who needed care simultaneously and nowhere to put them." She felt him laugh very quietly through his back. "It is modest, but it is sufficient." "It sounds exactly like you," he said, and then seemed to hear himself and said nothing more. But she felt the words in the air between them, specific and warm, and she did not dismiss them. Cimarron Creek appeared on the horizon with the morning sun behind it, its modest collection of buildings throwing long shadows westward across the pale grass. Susanna felt the complicated specific love she always felt when she came back to it. This small, improbable, resilient place that had made room for her in a way the world had not always made room for a woman who insisted on being what she was. She brought Stephen to her clinic through the back entrance, which was practical rather than secretive. The front of her house faced the street, and she did not want to explain his presence before she was ready to explain it. The clinic room smelled of dried herbs and clean linen, and the particular mineral quality of the antiseptic solution she made according to the Listerian method, adapted to the available materials of the frontier. Stephen stopped in the doorway and looked at the room with an expression she had not seen on his face before, which was a kind of quiet astonishment. She had expected the room to impress him, but she had not expected the degree of it. The walls had been fitted with shallow shelves that held dozens of labeled glass jars, roots and bark and dried flowers, and leaves in a careful taxonomy that she had developed herself. There was a proper examination table, padded, covered with clean canvas. A cabinet held her surgical instruments, laid out with the same organized precision. On a smaller table near the window sat her reference materials, a stack of medical texts and the correspondence she maintained with the physicians in St. Louis, tied with cord. A human skeleton, articulated and labeled in her own handwriting, hung in one corner, arms gently raised, which she used to explain anatomy to patients who needed to understand what she was treating. "You built all this," he said. "Over 4 years, yes," she said. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was the one she had been beginning to recognize all through the previous day and night, but now it was so completely open and undefended that it stopped her breath for a moment. It was not admiration of the distant, slightly uncomfortable kind she was accustomed to receiving. It was something that looked very much like wonder, personal, direct, specific to her. "I have never met anyone like you," he said. She held his gaze, and because she was Susanna Abbott and she had never learned the habit of deflecting a direct thing, she said, "I have never met anyone quite like you either." They looked at each other for a moment in the quiet morning room with the herbs and the books and the careful order she had made of her life, and the recognition that had been building between them since the moment she had crouched beside him on the canyon shelf was suddenly so present that it felt physical. Then she made herself step forward and attend to his leg, because that was the immediate necessity, and because the other thing was large enough that she needed to approach it slowly. Proper treatment of the ankle required new splinting materials, and she worked with her usual focused efficiency, but she explained everything as she did it, which she always did with patience, and with him it had taken on a particular quality. It was not quite intimacy, but it was adjacent to it, the kind of focused, specific attention that she gave to things that mattered. She fashioned a proper splint from thin boards padded with wool felt, bound with bandaging cloth. She applied a poultice of comfrey and willow bark that she made fresh while he watched, explaining the properties of each component and watching his face as he absorbed it. The comfrey promotes healing of the bone tissue, she said, applying it carefully. The exact mechanism is not well understood, but empirically the effect is well established. I have seen it consistently over 8 years of practice. And the willow bark reduces inflammation and pain. The active compound is called salicylic acid. It is being studied currently by chemists in Europe. The therapeutic use of the plant is far older than the chemistry. He was watching her hands as she worked, and she felt the watching, and it was not the watching of a patient observing a procedure. It was something more personal. "How did you come to know about the European research?" he asked. "I write to a physician in Philadelphia," she said, "Dr. Eleanor Whitfield. She has connections to the medical literature that she forwards to me. We have been corresponding for 2 years. She smoothed the final bandage into place. She is remarkable. She trained in Edinburgh when women were still fighting for the right to attend lectures. She passed every examination and was denied her degree on the grounds of her sex." Stephen's expression shifted to something harder. "That is a monstrous injustice." "Yes," she said simply, "it is. She practices anyway." She sat back and looked at her work. "There, that will hold properly. You need to stay off it for at minimum 6 weeks and then begin bearing weight gradually. Full healing will take 3 months. 6 weeks, he said. That is a long time. Less time than a permanently compromised ankle, she said, which is what you will have if you rush it. He held her gaze and almost smiled. I heard you. The days that followed built themselves around a domestic routine that Susanna had not had in 4 years of living alone, and she found, to her own careful surprise, that it was not uncomfortable. She had patience to see, her regular rounds through the town and the surrounding homesteads, but she came back to her clinic to find Stephen doing what she had told him to do, which was rest the leg and not put weight on it, and occupying himself with the materials she brought him. She had given him the medical texts, partly because she thought he might actually read them, and he did, asking questions in the evenings that were increasingly sophisticated. She had given him paper and ink, so he could continue making notes for his case against Garrett. And she had brought him her watercolor paints, on impulse, which he had looked at with a slightly startled expression, and then, the next morning when she came into the clinic with his breakfast, had found him sitting at the window with the small paint set and a sheet of paper, attempting a view of the street outside. It was not good. She told him so, honestly, and he agreed without defensiveness, and they ended up spending an hour that evening with her showing him about color mixing, and how to load a brush and how to see shapes rather than outlines, and she could see his engineer's mind adapting the principles as fast as she offered them. You are going to be better at this than you think, she said. The willow bark tea has interesting color properties, he said, which startled a laugh out of her that she had not been expecting. Word came from Obadiah Finn on the 4th day via a writer named Santos, a brief note that said only, Lewis arrived safely. The package is delivered. Watched. She knew what it meant. She showed it to Stephen, who read it and was quiet for a moment and then said, Now we wait. They waited. It was not passive waiting. Susanna's life did not accommodate passivity, and Stephen had adapted to the rhythm of her days with a flexibility that continued to surprise her. He could not move freely with the splinted ankle, and she had not wanted him visible on the street until she understood better how closely Garrett was watching for him. But within those limitations, he had made himself quietly useful in ways she had not anticipated. He organized her supply shelves according to a system he explained to her that she modified until it was better, and then he built 2 additional shelves from wood she had in her back lean-to, working carefully from a seated position with his legs supported. He wrote detailed notes on every stage of his treatment that she had requested for her records, and found, apparently, that he was good at medical description. He mended her fence. He fixed the hinge on the cabinet door that had been loose for 8 months. On the 6th evening he played the fiddle. She was in the next room writing up case notes when she heard it, and she stopped writing. He had told her he played poorly. He had, she supposed, set his standard very high, because what came through the wall was quiet and uncertain but genuinely musical, a simple melody she did not recognize that moved forward and then caught itself and moved again, finding its way, like something remembering itself. She sat very still and did not go in, because she understood that this was private and that to observe it was to be trusted with something he had not offered yet. She sat and listened until it stopped, and then she went back to her notes and said nothing about it. He said nothing about it either, but in the morning he was different in some way she could feel but could not precisely name. Lighter, as if something had been set down. On the 8th day, a rider came from Santa Rosa with a letter addressed to Deputy Stephen McCrae, care of General Delivery, Cimarron Creek. Susanna had asked Martin Oakes at the general store to watch for anything addressed to Stephen and bring it quietly, and Martin, who was cantankerous but not incurious, had done so without excessive questions. The letter was from U.S. Marshal James Culhane. She brought it to Stephen and watched him read it, watched his face move through careful expressions, and when he folded it and looked at her, there was something released in his eyes. "Garrett has been suspended pending investigation," he said. "The Danforth Railroad payments are confirmed. The marshal has taken depositions from 3 additional witnesses who came forward once the documents were made public." He paused. "There will be a hearing in 4 weeks. He wants me present." "That is good," she said. "It is," he said. "It is what this whole thing has been about." He set the letter on his knee and looked at her with an expression that was not quite the relief she expected. It was something more complicated than relief. "Susanna," he said, "when this is over, do not," she said softly, not unkindly, but she held up a hand and shook her head slightly. "Not yet. You have a hearing to prepare for and a leg that is not healed. There are things that need to be in their right order." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. He did not press it, which was exactly what she had needed him to do. He picked up the letter again and looked at it. "But I am saying the rest of it. Eventually." "I know," she said, and returned to her work. The following weeks had a quality that Susanna would remember for the rest of her life, the strange golden suspended quality of a time that is shaped by necessity but suffused with something richer. She was busy. Her practice did not rest because she had a recovering deputy in her clinic, and she moved through her days with her usual focused competence, and then she came home to find him there, and the coming home had acquired a different texture than it had ever had before. They talked in the evenings for hours. About his time as a ranger and what he had seen of the territory in those years, the way the landscape had changed, and the way the people in it had changed, and not always for the better. About her work, which she found herself describing with a completeness she rarely managed, because he asked questions that required full answers, and he listened to those answers with the whole of his attention. About the war, which neither of them had come through unchanged. He had fought for the Union, which she had supported, and they had both lost people in it, and they spoke of that carefully, with the carefulness of 2 people who had learned to carry grief without letting it prevent forward motion. She showed him one evening the watercolor she had made of the canyon the previous spring, the slant of light on the red walls, the particular blue of the sky at that altitude. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "This is where I fell," he said finally. Yes, she said. About 50 yards from where I found you. He looked at it a little longer. I want it, he said, if you are willing to part with it. She looked at the painting, which she had liked very much. She thought about it hanging somewhere else, belonging to someone else's looking. Yes, she said, I will give it to you. He looked up from the painting to her, and what was in his face then was so undefended and so clear that she felt it in her chest like a physical thing. Thank you, he said, and it was about the painting, and it was about considerably more than the painting, and they both knew it. The morning she removed his splint properly, 16 weeks after the initial injury, she went through the protocol she had established, testing his range of motion with careful, graduated pressure, watching his face for pain responses, assessing the healing by feel and observation. The fibula had knit cleanly. The joint was stable. She asked him to put weight on it, first with her steadying him and then on his own. He stood on both feet for the first time in weeks without aid, and something happened in his face that was so simple and so genuine that she had to look away. Well, he asked. It is healed, she said. You will need to build the strength back gradually. No running, no rough terrain for another 6 weeks, but you can walk, you can ride. He was quiet. She straightened her examination equipment, giving him the moment. I need to go to Santa Rosa, he said. The hearing is in 5 days. I know, she said. I will come back, he said. She turned to look at him. He was standing in the center of the clinic room with the full light of the morning window on him and both feet on the floor, and he said it with the same directness she had come to recognize as fundamental to his character, the same quality of precision applied to everything, examination to evidence to emotion. I know that too, she said, with equal directness. He crossed the room in 4 steps, which was not a lot of steps given the size of the room, and took her hands in his, which were large and careful in the way she had noticed from the very beginning. He held them and looked at her with the complete, undefended attention she had watched develop over weeks of proximity and shared necessity and evening conversation and watercolor lessons and quiet fiddle music through walls. I have been trying to find the right time, he said, and I have come to understand that with you there is not going to be a conventional right time because you live in real time and so do I. And so, he stopped and made a small sound of impatience with his own imprecision. Susanna Abbott, you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in 40 years of living, and I have thought about not much else but you for 16 weeks, and I would very much like to know if you will allow this to be something. She looked at him. She looked at their hands joined. She looked at his face, which was not a simple face. It had been made by years and weather and conviction and loss and was more interesting for all of it. It is already something, she said. I think we both know that. He exhaled, and then he smiled, and it was the first full, unguarded smile she had seen from him, and it rearranged his entire face into something that made her understand, with the diagnostic clarity she applied to all significant things, that she was in very serious trouble and was completely fine with it. He went to Santa Rosa for the hearing, and he came back 5 days later as he had said he would, riding the bay mare Renee back to Fenn Station, and then a hired horse the rest of the way, and he arrived in Cimarron Creek on a bright November afternoon and came directly to her clinic and knocked on the door with the particular knock she had apparently already memorized, because she knew it was him before she opened it. He stood in her doorway with road dust on his coat and news in his eyes. Garrett has been removed from office and indicted on federal charges, he said. The hearing is going to trial. And 3 Apache families have already returned to the grazing lands that Garrett's campaign drove them from. She felt that last thing move through her like something she had no simple name for. She thought of Hanovi and her family. She thought of the 3 dead scouts in the burned camp. She thought about what it meant for those families to come home. That matters enormously, she said. I know, he said. I thought about that, I thought about you, the whole ride. He stepped into the doorway and she stepped back to let him in, and the small space of her threshold held them close enough that she could see the lines beside his eyes and the exact color of his hair in the late light, which was a warm brown with gray beginning at the temples, and she thought it was an excellent color. "There is something else," he said. He was not visibly nervous, but she had learned to read the fine calibrations, and there was something running under the surface. "When this is over, Culhane has offered me a position, U.S. Deputy Marshal, based anywhere in the territory with a requirement to travel the circuit twice a year." She processed this. "Based anywhere," she repeated. "Cimarron Creek, for example," he said, "if the resident healer had no strong objections to a federal lawman setting up nearby." She held his gaze for a long moment. "She would not have strong objections," she said carefully. "She would have questions." "Ask them," he said. "Are you asking to stay?" she said. "Or asking permission to ask?" He breathed out slowly. "I am asking to stay," he said. "I am asking," he stopped, and this time the imprecision was not impatience but care. He was choosing words that were equal to what he meant. "I know who you are, Susanna. I know that you are not a woman who needs a man to make her complete, and I know that you have built a life that is wholly yours and that any addition to it is on your terms. I am not asking to change what you are. I am asking if there is room, in the life you have made, for what I am." She was quiet for a long moment. The clinic smelled of herbs and clean linen, and the mild antiseptic that she added to the wash water. The afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle she loved. Outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of Cimarron Creek, Martin Oakes arguing with someone about the price of something, a horse on the road, Ada Bright ringing the school bell though the school day was done, just because she liked the sound. "Yes," she said, "there is room." They were married in February of 1874, in the church that Reverend Callum ran in its comfortable ecumenical way, with Obadiah Fenn and his wife Gratiana in attendance, and Louis Fenn, who had ridden all night through the dark with a letter that had saved several lives, and Martin Oakes, who was cantankerous at weddings, as at all other times, but who had closed the general store for the afternoon without being asked. Ada Bright had decorated the church with dried wildflowers from the canyon, because Susanna had told her about the canyon once and Ada had remembered. Hanovi came, traveling the 40 miles on horseback with 2 other women from the camp, and sat in the back of the church and did not say anything during the ceremony. But afterward, she took Susanna's hands in hers and spoke to her in Mescalero Apache, and Susanna answered in kind. And Stephen watched this with an expression that she had come to know as his particular variety of love, which looked very much like wonder. He had traded in the deputy's badge and accepted the marshal's appointment. He was learning, with the same methodical determination he applied to everything, about the work of Susanna's practice, not to do it, which was not his calling, but to understand it, because understanding the things that mattered to the people he loved was something he believed in. He had rebuilt her back lean-to into a proper storage room. He had finally, irrevocably, learned to play the fiddle with competence, and could now be heard most evenings making music that was genuinely pleasant, though he still claimed he was playing poorly and regarded this claim as important to maintain. He had begun painting watercolors with an earnestness that had produced, by spring, 3 works that were actually quite good, and which hung on the clinic wall alongside Susanna's paintings, his alongside hers. In the fall of 1874, Susanna discovered that she was pregnant. She made the discovery with the same methodical competence she applied to all diagnoses, assessed the evidence carefully, accounted for the timing, and then sat with it for one evening in the gentle way that she always sat with large things before she spoke about them. When she told Stephen the next morning over coffee in their kitchen, she watched his face move through a sequence of expressions that was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from him, and that was saying something because Stephen McCrae was not a guarded man with her. He set down his cup. He was quiet for a full 30 seconds, which she counted. Then he said, "Are you well?" She loved him for that the first thing was her. "I am very well," she said. "Everything is exactly as it should be." He came around the table and she stood up and he held her with the careful strength that was characteristic of him, and he said, against her hair, "I did not expect to have this." He said it very quietly. "Any of this life. After the war I thought," he stopped. "I did not expect any of this." "Neither did I," she said honestly. "That is the interesting thing about necessary things. They arrive whether you are expecting them or not." Their son, James Fenn McCrae, was born in June of 1875, delivered by Susanna's own careful hands and the assistance of Graciana Fenn, who had traveled up from Arrowhead Station and proved to be an exceptionally calm birth assistant. He was named for the U.S. Marshal whose willingness to act on evidence had started the chain of consequence, and for Obadiah Fenn whose station had been their refuge in the dark. He arrived healthy and loud, and with a look of focused indignation that Susanna recognized from somewhere she could not quite place until Stephen, standing at her bedside with his newborn son and his whole face open with something she had never seen on any human face before and hoped never to forget, said softly, "He looks like he has opinions." "He does," she said. "I wonder where he gets that." The trial of Hollis Garrett concluded in the autumn of 1875, ending in a conviction on federal charges of fraud, conspiracy, and being accessory to violence against the Mescalero Apache. The sentence was 10 years in the federal penitentiary, and Stephen attended the sentencing as a witness and came home on a clear October evening with the autumn turning the cottonwoods gold along the creek, and Susanna had baby James on her hip and dinner on the stove. And when Stephen walked through the door, she could see in his face that something that had been taught in him for years had finally released. He stood in the kitchen and looked at her and the baby and the room and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of the life they had built, and she saw him understand that it was over. The long, dangerous, costly effort of years had resulted in something actual. Justice is slow in the territories and imperfect, and sometimes it does not come at all, and they both knew that. But this time it had come, and the families who had been driven from their lands had come home, and the man responsible was going to be held accountable. He kissed her and held James and helped her finish dinner, and after James was asleep they sat on the small porch Susanna had added to the front of the house in the spring, looking out at Cimarron Creek in the evening, and she said, "How does it feel?" He thought about it, which was the thing she loved about him, that he always thought about questions before answering them. "Like something that has been wrong for a long time is now right," he said, "and like there is more work to do which is also right." "Yes," she said, "that is how it feels to me too." He took her hand, which was something he did frequently and which she had come to rely on in the specific way that you rely on things that are offered with complete consistency. It was warm and steady, and it felt like everything it was. "I want to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The day you found me in the canyon," he said. "When you crouched down beside me and started going through your kit and told me to drink the willow bark extract. I was in a very great deal of pain and I was fairly certain I was going to die there. And then you looked at me and you said, 'I need you to trust me completely,' and there was something in the way you said it that." He paused. "I had never in my life heard competence sound so certain, so absolute. I had been among capable people, rangers, soldiers, marshals, and none of them had ever made me feel the way you did in that moment. Like the situation was going to be all right, not because it had to be, but because someone understood it completely." She looked at him in the October evening. The creek sounded in the middle distance. James was asleep inside. "And then you navigated us out of that canyon in 3 hours in the dark," he continued. "And you set up my treatment and wrote out the treatment plan and explained the mechanism of the willow bark and showed me your clinic, and I understood that what I had felt in the canyon was not an impression created by crisis. It was accurate." He turned to look at her directly. "You are exactly what you appear to be, which is a thing so rare that I have not stopped being astonished by it." She looked at him for a long moment. "I spent a long time," she said carefully, "learning how to be exactly what I appear to be, because the alternative was to be smaller than I was, and I could not afford that. The people who needed me could not afford it. I know, he said. "That is what I am trying to say." He brought her hand up and held it in both of his. "You did not become who you are despite the difficulty of it. You became who you are because you decided that the difficulty was not a reason to be less than what you could be. And that is the most extraordinary thing I have ever had the privilege of being close to." She felt something in her chest that was not sadness and was not quite joy and was probably the compound emotion that does not have a simple name, the emotion of being seen. Accurately, specifically, without reduction or exaggeration. "Seen. Stephen McCrae," she said. "You are an eloquent man when you decide to be." "I have a high-standard audience," he said. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her and they sat on the porch in the last light of that October evening. And the town moved around them in its ordinary way. Horses on the road and lamplight coming on in the windows and the school bell in the distance making its sound that Ada Bright loved. And the creek, always the creek, finding its way south through the pale grass. James grew into a boy with his mother's dark eyes and his father's focused patience, and an absolute terror for anything to do with the horses that was so complete and so resolute that by the age of 3, he had successfully negotiated with both parents the arrangement that he would learn to ride when he was ready and not before. Susanna found this entirely reasonable. Stephen found it entirely reasonable too, though he also found it entertaining in a private way. He expressed mostly through a particular quality of stillness that Susanna had learned to identify as suppressed amusement. In 1877, a second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Hanovi McCrae, the middle name given with the full knowledge and blessing of the woman for whom she was named, who came to Cimarron Creek for the naming ceremony, and brought with her a cradle board made of willow and rawhide, and a small piece of turquoise on a cord that she tied around Clara's wrist with words in Mescalero Apache that Susanna translated for Stephen as something close to, "May she know exactly what she is." "She will," Susanna said, looking at her daughter. "I am going to see to it." The clinic grew. A third examination room was added when the caseload made it necessary. A young woman from a ranch outside of town, Maria Elena Vasquez, began coming in as an assistant 2 days a week, and she was quick and capable and curious, and Susanna recognized the hunger in her that she had recognized in herself and began teaching her everything she knew, properly and systematically, the way her grandmother had taught her, and the way Hanovi had taught her. "You are training her," Stephen said one evening, watching from the doorway as Susanna and Maria Elena worked through a case study. "Yes," Susanna said. "Good," he said, simply and completely. She looked over her shoulder at him and smiled. Stephen's work as deputy marshal took him away for weeks at a time on the circuit, which was hard, the particular hardness of a necessary absence from people you love completely. He always came back. He wrote letters from every station that had mail service, long detailed letters in his precise hand that Susanna kept in a box in the bedroom, sorted by date, because they were the ongoing record of a mind she found endlessly interesting, and she intended to keep them. She wrote back with equal length and detail, the cases she was working on, the children, the progress of the clinic, the new things she was learning, the paintings she had made. He brought back things from his circuit travels. Plants she did not have in her collection. Books purchased from territorial towns that happened to have a bookseller. Stories. Once, a small brass telescope from a mining engineer who had wagered it in a card game and lost, and Stephen had won it and thought of her immediately, and she had set it on the porch and used it to study the stars on clear nights with a focus that reminded him of watching her navigate the canyon, the same quality of complete attention. In 1879 they heard that the Danforth Railroad Company had been forced, under terms related to the Garrett conviction, to formally relinquish claims on 3 sections of traditional Mescalero land and to pay a financial settlement to the families affected. It was not enough. They both knew it was not enough, and they said so to each other and to anyone who would listen, because they had both learned that calling insufficient things insufficient was the only honest response to them. But it was something. In a territory where injustice frequently went not only unpunished but unremarked, it was something real. James, at the age of 5, decided he wanted to learn to read. He approached this with the same focused intensity he had applied to the horse negotiation, and sat with his mother every evening going through the books on her shelf with a patience that was remarkable for his age. Within 3 months he was reading simple texts. Within 6 months he was reading Ada Bright's school books. Ada told Susanna that she had never seen a child learn so quickly and with so little apparent effort, and Susanna smiled and said that he hid the effort, which was something he had from his father. Clara, at 2, had strong opinions about her hat, and about the direction water should flow in a puddle, and about which color of dried bean she preferred for breakfast. She had her mother's dark, direct gaze, and she deployed it with an effectiveness that Susanna watched with a private delight she did not entirely disguise. On a bright morning in the spring of 1880, Stephen McCrae stood on the porch of the house in Cimarron Creek with his coffee, and the view he had come to love with the specificity that he loved all particular things in his life: the creek and the cottonwoods and the school bell, and the way the light came over the hills east of town. He could hear Susanna inside, talking to Maria Elena about a case they were managing, her voice carrying the precise and confident quality it always had when she was working, the quality he had first heard in a canyon 60 feet below the rim, crouched beside him in the red dust with her kit open. He thought about the rope that had frayed. He thought about all the things that had to be exactly as they were for him to be exactly here. The saddlebag he had found, the trail he had taken, the shortcut through the canyon, the fraying rope. And in the canyon, in the last moment before he had understood that he was truly stranded and truly alone and truly in danger, a woman kneeling in the dust of the canyon floor who had looked up from her harvesting knife and seen him fall. He had never been a man who believed in the providential management of events. He had seen too much that was manifestly unmanaged, too much that went wrong when no divine hand intervened, too much loss and cruelty and injustice allowed to run its course without correction from above. He did not believe that the rope had frayed because something had arranged for it to fray. But he believed, with the complete conviction that he applied to things he knew with certainty, that Susanna Abbott was the most important person he had ever met, and that he had come to know her because of a canyon and a frayed rope and an afternoon that had nearly killed him, and that the arrangement of it was not something he needed to explain. It was something he needed to honor, every day, in the specific and particular ways available to him, which he intended to go on doing for as long as he was given. The door opened behind him, and she came out onto the porch with her own coffee, and stood beside him looking east at the morning. "Maria Elena handled the diagnosis herself this morning," she said. "Without my input, she was exactly right." "You are pleased," he said. "Very," she said. "She is going to be extraordinary." He looked at her in the morning light, which suited her the way the canyon light had suited the canyon, as if the light had arranged itself to cooperate. He thought she was more beautiful at 33 than she had been at 26, which was a thing he had concluded had to do with the way competence and certainty of purpose looked on a person who had spent years earning them. "What?" she said, catching him looking. "I was thinking," he said, "about a canyon." She looked at him for a moment, and something moved in her expression that he had catalogued carefully over 6 years, and still found endlessly interesting, a kind of warmth that was entirely specific to him. He knew this because he had watched her with other people, with her patients and her children and her friends, and she was warm with all of them. But the warmth she had for him was different in a way that was not performative, because Susanna did not perform things. It was simply different in quality, in the way that the same light through different windows makes different rooms. "Redstone Canyon," she said. "Yes. I should go back," she said thoughtfully. "My harvesting kit has needed restocking for 2 months, and there are plants there that—" "I know," he said. "I want to come with you." She looked at him with the small lift at the corner of her mouth that was her smile in its most concentrated form. "You have walked that terrain. You know how difficult it is." "My leg has been healed for 6 years," he said, "and I would like to see where it happened, where you found me." She was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she nodded. "We will need to arrange care for James and Clara next week if the weather holds." "Next week," he agreed. They went back on a Tuesday in May, just the two of them and their horses, with Susanna's harvesting kit and his rifle and a blanket roll in case they needed it, and they rode into the canyon mouth in the mid-morning light. She moved through the canyon with the same ease she always had, fluid and certain, occasionally pointing things out that he had not noticed the first time because he had been in no position to notice anything. The seep spring, the particular formation of the upper wall, the place where the yerba santa grew densest, which she cut with the same small curved knife, working quickly and systematically, talking to him about each plant as she harvested it with the focused pleasure of someone doing something they love. He found the shelf, the ledge where he had fallen 8 feet below the canyon floor, the shelf of red rock where he had lain with a broken ankle and a dislocated knee, and the documents pressed against his chest, and the blue sky very far above. He stood at the edge and looked down at it. "Here," he said. She came and stood beside him. She looked down at the shelf and then up at the canyon wall where the rope had been. "Here," she agreed. They were quiet for a moment, side by side on the canyon floor, looking at the place where something had changed. "I was terrified," he said. He had not said that before directly in those words. "Not of dying, I mean yes of dying, but mostly of failing, of not getting what I had found to people who could use it, of Garrett escaping accountability." "I know," she said. "I could see it." "You could. You had the look," she said, "of a man who has important unfinished business. It is a specific look. I have seen it in patients who hold on past the point where they should let go because there is something that is not done yet." She turned to look at him. "I thought about it later. About what you must have thought when a strange woman appeared out of the canyon wall and told you to drink something. I thought you were the most competent person I had ever seen," he said, "which was an unusual thought to have while lying on a rock with a broken leg." "Good timing, then," she said. He laughed. A real laugh, the full kind, which bounced off the canyon walls in a way that sounded extravagant in the narrow space. And she laughed too, and the sound of it filled the canyon. This sound that the canyon had never heard before and which felt, to him, like the right sound for it to hold. He took her hand and she let him, and they stood in Redstone Canyon in the May morning with the plants growing in the seep-fed places and the red walls rising around them and the sky an impossible blue above. And the world was not perfect, had never been perfect, would not become perfect, but it was real and it was theirs, and they had built it from the raw materials of courage and patience and honest work, and the willingness to trust a stranger's competent hands in a crisis. And that was more than enough. That was, in fact, everything. They rode back to Cimarron Creek in the afternoon, with Susanna's satchel full of harvested plants and the contentment of people who have visited a significant place and left it respectfully. James met them at the gate with a story about Clara having put a dried bean in her ear which had required the diplomatic intervention of Ada Bright. Susanna assessed Clara's ear with the professional attention that she gave to all clinical concerns, confirmed that the bean had exited through the natural processes of a determined 3-year-old, and told James he had handled it well, which made him stand 4 inches taller. Stephen made dinner, which was something he had become genuinely competent at, because competence was a value that lived in the household and applied to everyone in it. Afterward, in the long May evening, he played the fiddle on the porch, and he played it well, a thing he had long since stopped pretending otherwise, and Clara sat on Susanna's lap and James lay on the porch floor looking at the stars through the brass telescope, and the creek ran on to the south, and the cottonwoods moved in the warm air, and the music went out into the Cimarron Creek evening and found its way to the people who heard it, Martin Oakes pausing in his evening tasks, Ada Bright at her window with a book, the new family that had arrived in the fall from Kansas and not yet quite felt that they belonged, hearing the music and feeling, without knowing why, that they might. Susanna sat in the May evening with her daughter warm and heavy in her lap, listening to the fiddle, and looked at the man playing it, this large, particular, steady man who had fallen into her canyon and her life in that sequence, and thought about all the words she had in her. The medical vocabulary and the botanical names and the correspondence with the Philadelphia physician and the Mescalero Apache she had learned from Hanoi and the Tennessee her grandmother had spoken, and the proper Spanish she had learned for the territory. All these languages, and none of them had a single word adequate to what she felt in this moment. Which was, she had decided, exactly as it should be. The things worth most were always slightly in excess of the available vocabulary. That was how you knew they mattered. Clara fell asleep in her arms. James fell asleep on the porch with the telescope pressed to one eye and his free hand still pointed at the stars. The fiddle played on into the warm dark, and Susanna sat in the middle of everything she had built and everything that had found her, and felt, with the diagnostic precision she had applied her whole life to the understanding of complex systems, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Which was not a thing she had always believed was possible. Which made it, now that it was true, more valuable than she had ever thought to count.